Hello, welcome back to the Orientation on American Politics in preparation for Public Policy 202. This is part two, where we're going to cover normative issues in policymaking and really look at the divergent philosophies that underlie people's beliefs about what's appropriate for government. This will be the hardest haul in some ways for the orientation, some pretty big and deep issues to think about, but also some very interesting data from the United States. So the normative imperatives in the policy analytic process. What am I talking about? Well, in a democratic system, for policy action to have credibility, to be legitimate in the eyes of the electorate, to be accountable to the voters, has to resonate with underlying values that people have and understandings of society and what the government ought to be doing. Uh, it also, knowing these philosophical differences and how they are laid out among the American public and among our elected officials in the United States, is also important for identifying what are the strategic constraints and opportunities. Just think about the last several years and think about 2020 in particular, how significant it is that people have real differences over what is a fact and what's true or not. And there are profound differences that people have about where the government should be headed are not headed, and has led to a good deal of stalemate in our system, and there are reasons why that's happening. Let's think of it this way. Let's think of the perceptions that people have and how they have, all of us have an ideological lens. That ideological lens is got three major psychological attributes to it. One is we all engage in one way or another in what's called motivated reasoning. We get from point A to point B to point C in our argumentation and our thinking process, largely motivated by what we already believe to be true and what our values are and what we think is how people function in a society. We also engage in selective perception. We're not constantly looking for all kinds of information. We tend to be out looking selectively for the information that supports where we want to take things already. And then finally, there's confirmation bias. When information does come at us, maybe a broad spectrum of information, we tend to latch on to that information that confirms what we already believe, that is confirming of the truth that we think exists. Now, that's all this is true of all of us. Some of us have greater discipline, maybe through social scientific training, for instance, to raise questions about whether or not our psychological processes are in fact directing us towards real evidence. But everybody has these attributes, and it's like a lens, let's call it a diverging lens, where you have incoming light in parallel and then out through the lens it diverges. So imagine, think of this as a metaphor for evidence and policy analysis. That hits each individual's lens differently, and it's going to have a different outcome. And that's going to raise questions about the credibility of the information, or even what basic meaning people give to that information. So how do we overcome that? We need to think about how do we perhaps bridge those differences or overcome those differences in some way. One is by using effective narratives, an instrument of how we communicate about things that tries to bring meaning and credibility for different sets of people. And sometimes it's a matter of building coalitions where one side simply has to win or needs a coalition to win over others, but that coalition may mean building up in ways in which we grapple with these differences among different points of view. Simple process. Policy is achieved through politics. Politics is a contestation of ideas and interests, and in turn, ideas and interests get embodied in values and ideology. Just ask yourself, where do you stand on issues? Why do you stand in those positions? Why do you hold those positions? And how do you deal with those with whom you disagree? And do you even interact with people with whom you disagree? Much of what drives differences in values and ideology comes from a number of differences in how people think the world works. One is, what causes variations in the resources and personal endowments among individuals? Well, some people think these are natural processes, that are God-given talents, some get more than others, or that there's just natural human variation in people's capabilities, and they get rewarded or punished in say, the market economy because of that. And that's just the way it is, and that's fair. Others think, now, wait a minute. We know historically there have been a number of forces in play that have created structural and legacy biases. Certainly racism in the United States, sexism in most places around the world, colonialism in the United States and other places around the world, where the white European powers came and settled on this continent when there was a previous population. All those things have had lasting impact on the capacity for people on an equitable basis across the board to have opportunity on an equitable basis. Another core issue is what motivates human behavior and productivity. Some people think that folks work hard and strive because they fear, they're scared that they won't be able to eat, or their family will starve, or will not have housing, or the things they need to live a quality life, and that they're rewarded if they, through that fear, work very hard. Others have a completely different view, that what allows people to be effective in productive in the economy and to promote their own welfare and interest is in fact being part of a community that assures that there is support and creates opportunity and the security of knowing they're not going to starve, knowing that they're not going to go without healthcare, knowing that they're not going to miss out on educational opportunities, knowing that they're not going to be living on the streets. Two diametrically opposed views about what undergirds human behavior, and that has political consequences. Another division, relatedly, is can government action effectively promote opportunity and fairness, or is it a tyrannical risk to individual liberty? Again, deep divide. Some people think of government as providing a hand up, assuring people's rights, creating opportunities, helping them promote their own autonomy, reach their fulfillment, and engage and being active in civil engagement in the society. Other people think what government does is not a hand up, it's a handout. It's taking from people who are productive and giving to people who aren't productive. And it leads those people into dependency, sloth, and surrendering their individual autonomy. Two diametrically opposed ideas, and yet they both exist in the same society, in this society, and others around the world. So how can we unpack some of these ideas and what it means in foundational philosophical principles? Let's start with John Rawls, who was a professor of philosophy at Harvard, and his very famous book, A Theory of Justice. And the theme he has of justice is fairness. This is really one of the foundations of progressive or liberal thinking about how a society should be organized and therefore what government should do. It's based on social contract theory, which I'm not going to go into. We don't have time for that. But the idea is Rawls would be asking individuals as rational actors, autonomous rational actors, what kind of society would they want to create if they did not know where they would be in that society? Would they have lots of resources, or would they be very poor? Would they have various kinds of natural talents, or would they be more limited? If you do not know what your circumstances are going to be, if you can be put behind the veil of ignorance, Rawls argues that people would choose a society in which it promotes two principles of justice. One is that there should be maximum liberty, that's a primary good. People want to be free. But the second is what he calls the difference principle. They would want a society in which the least well off, which they might be, will be as well off as they possibly can be. Now, that won't be everyone being economically equal, same income, same wealth, because that would lead to an economic system of pretty low productivity, and everybody would be worse off. So the idea is there's going to be some difference between the most well off and the least well off, but that difference should be the kind that promotes a kind of economy and society in which the least well off person is well off as it possibly can be. That requires government intervention. That requires taxation. That requires redistribution. That requires social programs to help create what Rawls calls distributive justice. And that in turn promotes individual fulfillment. Well, Rawls at Harvard had a philosophy colleague, Robert Nozick, who had a completely different view of what is a just society. And his book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, which also in some ways parallels the decades earlier Hayek book On the Road to Serfdom, is really a treatise on libertarianism. And here the notion is, what he calls entitlement theory, which has its own principles, three basic principles. First, justice in acquisition. In other words, it's as long as everybody has resources and property that was originally fairly distributed, that's the important issue. Then anything that happens after that has to happen through justice and transfer, meaning that we each engage in voluntary actions. Let's say going into the marketplace, I give you some dollars, you give me a product back. As long as that, or I get a job and you pay me for it. As long as that's all done through voluntary action, even if that promotes greater and greater inequality, it's fair and just because of the voluntary nature of those transactions. And finally, rectification as injustice. So suppose someone steals your property. Well, that's a problem, and that needs to be rectified. And we do that through a very minimalist state that protects property and contracts. Now, if those three principles are in place, Nozick argues, any government reallocation through taxation, redistribution, regulation, any government action of that kind violates liberty. Taxation, in fact, is a form of forced labor. You have to keep working more hours, more days in order to pay your tax bill to the federal government, the United States, the state governments, local governments. Some people think of taxation as theft, as literally stealing. The implication, unlike Rawls, the opposite, is that there shouldn't be government social insurance. There shouldn't be social welfare state programs. There shouldn't be business regulations. There shouldn't be environmental regulations or other kinds of social regulations. All that is a form of stealing from some and giving to others, and robs people of their own dignity and creates dependency. And not only that, it grants power to the state that can be used for tyrannical purposes. So Rawls and Nozick couldn't be more different. A third stream, and I'm simplifying things astronomically here, a third stream has to do with the foundations of what's called communitarianism. Another Harvard professor, in this case Michael Sandel, a political theorist in the government department, wrote a book called Liberalism and the Limits of Social Justice. And Sandel argues that you can't be a Nozick or a Rawls and put rational, autonomous individual actors in some kind of thought process because we are not autonomous. We are all embedded in families. We have values and definitions of meaning that are socially determined in those group settings of various kinds. We exist in communities, in social relations. And so the notion of going behind the veil of ignorance doesn't make sense. And instead, we need to focus on these kinds of interconnections that people have within their various kinds of social settings. They cannot be individuals completely in the veil of ignorance. Now, there are other critiques of Rawls and social contract theory that are similar in theme, but take on a very important historical understanding of what has transpired in society. One is the feminist critique. Carol Pateman, who was on the faculty at UCLA in political science, among others, make the argument that when you've had millennia of patriarchal society, it's inconceivable to think of the people who have been subject to that, women, to have a sense of being behind the veil of ignorance and what that might mean. It's an oppressive society of that kind doesn't allow for these individuals to come up with a reflective sense of what would be a just society without taking into consideration the millennia of consequences. Similarly, in critical race theory, led by Kimberly Crenshaw at UCLA Law School, among others, who also came up or has really promoted the theme of intersectionality, combining race and gender and class, for instance, along with several others, make the argument you've got 400 years of oppression of African Americans in the United States, including now with the ongoing legacies of the past, as well as ongoing structural racism, fully encumbering the capacity for people to strive for what should be equal opportunity and equal rights, also takes them out of anything that makes sense in the context of John Rawls. And Rawls' version of that kind of social contract is simply missing the consequences of what has happened with those years of oppression based on the social construct of race. We should also think about, I think, several forms of communitarianism. And it's not just one, doesn't have just one meaning. And I'm using the term fairly loosely, but I want to pose a couple different versions of it. One is a set of ideas on the ideological right, which I think revolve around the notion of cultural affinity. Think of religious social conservatives in the United States who have a very distinctive view of what the proper gender roles are for men and women, and being not particularly open to transgender notions, or who are opposed to abortion and very concerned about there being too liberal a notion of reproductive rights, that in fact reproduction ought to happen in the context only of a marriage, and that marriage is only between a man and a woman. And also they're very concerned about protections of faith, expressions of religious faith, and making that almost a preeminent right that people have. Another version that's from Edmund Burke in England a couple centuries ago. And Burkean conservatives may not focus on that kind of religious orientation, but they're committed to a sense of a natural order of things, a natural moral law, civic society as an ongoing enterprise, and traditional institutions. If you want to get a read on that kind of version of what this ideological communitarianism would be on the conservative side, Robert Nisbet's book, The Quest for Community, is probably one of the preeminent examples. Recently, we've had another version, what I'll call Trumpism, which is really rooted in this populist notion of a kind of mass mobilization behind a particular individual, particular personality, a populist orientation, nationalistic about America first, anti-immigration, and anti-multiculturalism. Again, about sustaining a cultural affinity about something they perceive to be what an America should look like. There's also communitarianism on the left, and here I would put that in terms of economic solidarity. One version of this is what we call social democracy, a sense of maybe a capitalist economy, but with the solidarity that is produced by a robust social welfare state that ensures that people have a fair distribution of resources, they have real opportunities to succeed, and they have healthcare, education, housing, and so along the way. Now, many people in the United States, among conservatives, look at Scandinavia, for instance, and they see a collectivist society, not an individualist society like the United States. Anu Partanen is a Finnish journalist who wrote a book some years ago called The Nordic Theory of Everything, In Search of a Better Life, in which she makes a quite different argument. She suggests that the Nordic approach in having a robust social welfare state is to, in fact, ensure that people as individuals have the support they need to be able to pursue their own opportunities, their own sense of identity and where they want to go with their lives. And in a sense, it frees up the individual. It's not a collective holding back. Another version of a ideological left economic solidarity notion has to do with democratic socialism. This is a notion, and Carol Pateman, again at UCLA, wrote a book along these lines, Participation in Democratic Theory. And the notion here is that we think of democratic processes when we're electing officials to run our local governments or state or national governments or provinces, whatever they may be. But there's a broader notion of how democratic processes and participation and engagement can happen in every location in our lives, including in the workplace. So imagine companies being run by the workers through a democratic process, as opposed to having a corporate board and a management and shareholders who are so removed from the actual workers of the enterprise who make whatever it is the company does. And then, of course, there's socialism, Marxism, really the full Marxist routine of a sense that there shouldn't be private property, that there's collective ownership of the means of production. This has a significant presence, obviously, in various countries around the world, a very, very minimal presence in the United States, despite what you hear in the campaign rhetoric of 2020 about rampant socialism in the United States being proposed by Democrats, for instance. Okay. We can put these things together and think about major ideological domains that separate people in among voters, for instance. Let's think of two dimensions. An economic dimension, at one end of the spectrum, is thinking of a very minimalist state, doing very little, the kind of note-sick libertarian notion. The other is an activist state, really engaged in trying to provide people with security, social and economic security, opportunities in employment and so on, and education in order to thrive. A second dimension has to do with social and cultural issues. And here the notion is of a limited state at one end of the spectrum, in which people say, stay out of my life. Don't tell me whom I can marry. Don't tell me what I can consume. Don't tell me how I can act. That's not the role of government. Versus at the other end, we'll call it the conservative end, saying, no, the state has a role in defining what is moral, has a role in defining what is a family, what is a marriage, what is life, and that life starts at conception, and that abortion should be outlawed, and that all kinds of sexual engagement ought to be happening within the context of marriage and not outside of marriage, setting the moral norms of the society at that end of the spectrum. We place what we've already been talking about, libertarianism. Libertarians don't want government to get in the way of their economic activity, and they don't want the government to interfere in their social activity. Then there are the liberal progressives, kind of out of the Rawlsian tradition of not wanting the government to tell you what to do on the social side for the most part, but wanting to promote distributive justice, if you will. And then we can add the social democratic and democratic socialist components there. I don't know exactly where they fit in the scheme, but somewhere in that position. Then we have the social conservatives, who will focus primarily on the notion of the state setting moral boundaries, but not particularly wanting it to get involved in economic activity and not wanting it to regulate business life and things of that sort. And here I put business conservatives in where they're not really interested in the social dimension at all. They want to stay removed from that, but they're very interested in ensuring low taxation, low regulation of enterprises in the marketplace. And then we have something, I don't know whether to call it populist or not. It's probably not the right label. I don't know exactly what the right label is, but it's the notion of people who are economic liberals. They want government to be active in providing people with economic and social opportunity, but they are socially and culturally conservative in that they also want the government to define the moral boundaries of what the society is supposed to be and what its moral boundaries are supposed to be. And what we see is you can use this scheme in almost any country, and really any country, and then start asking empirical questions. So for instance, the Pew Research Center a while ago asked a number of questions in a number of countries. And this question at the top here asked, now both of these questions have to do with really the sense of to what extent is individualism a defining feature of a society? To what extent are these libertarian inclinations, so to speak? And if you ask the question of what % of people disagree that success in life is pretty much determined by forces outside our control, the United States is towards the end of the spectrum of saying, no, it is in my control. I'm an autonomous, free individual, and it is in my control. And that's very different from countries around the world, from all parts of the world, Europe and Asia, so on. The second question here is people who say it is very important, scoring a 10 on a 0 to 10 scale, to work hard to get ahead of life. In the United States, again, at the tops of the spectrum or near the top of the spectrum is saying, yes, you can work hard and get ahead in life. 3/4 of the American population think that, at least in this survey, and it gets reinforced by politicians. President Clinton back in 1993 talked about this as the idea that if you work hard and play by the rules, you'll be rewarded with a good life for yourself and a better chance for your children. So nothing's holding you back. It's just if you play by the rules and you work hard, you'll gain advantage. And of course, there are a lot of critiques of that notion. Well, let's take the data from 2016 that were assembled by Lee Drutman, a really terrific political scientist, and plot Trump voters and Clinton voters, Trump in red, Clinton in blue, and the third party voters, Jill Stein from the Green Party and Johnson from the Libertarian Party in yellow, and place them on these two dimensions of the economic dimension and the social dimension that I talked about earlier. And what you see is, one, there are people spread across all of these quadrants. Number two, you'll see that really true libertarians are relatively few and far between in the United States. Only 4% fit into that quadrant of a small state in terms of both economic and social policy, social issues, I should say. Liberals, a pretty significant component here, 45% of the voters in this sample in 2016. And you see a very significant number of people wanting government to take action for economic opportunity, but not to get engaged and involved in people's social lives. will place social democratic and democratic socialists there. Social conservatives are also a significant component of the American public, about 23%. And these, again, are the folks who are not so interested in major government intervention in the marketplace to or market opportunity or economic opportunity, but some degree, but a great deal of concern about wanting the government to set the kind of moral boundaries and to define what is a traditional representation of American society. And then you have, again, what I've called populists, it may not be the right name, about 30%. And you see a mix of Democrats, Republicans, and third-party voters here. So it's a real kind of combination of various dimensions of where the government should be actively involved. Now let's cut this pie in a couple ways. If we take Rawls, again, this distributive justice versus Nozick, this kind of libertarian notion, and put it on that economic left-right scale, you see that there are people, that scale is pretty widely represented across the board in the United States, but it doesn't quite capture the dimensionality. What we can say is in the United States, there are relatively few people who are really just want an unfettered, unregulated, free market without much in the way of any government intervention. Most people, the vast majority of people, believe there are roles for government to play in one way or another on this economic dimension. What we do see, though, is this divide really seems to be diagonal, not vertical or horizontal. And that, in a sense, reflects, I think, the division between on a communitarian scale, between those on the right who are engaged in a desire for cultural affinity, and those on the left who are engaged in a desire for economic solidarity. In many ways, that seems to be a dividing line where there's a general notion that's not just a free of any kind of social engagement, community engagement, family engagement, but the division really is between this traditional cultural affinity versus a more progressive economic solidarity. We can apply this to a particular policy area, one that I work a lot on, healthcare and healthcare reform. And I've plotted here on just a left-right dimension, a kind of the economic dimension of a healthcare system that it's all government financing and delivering on care on the left, or all free market financing and delivery of care on the right. The one on the left you can think of as the social democratic solidarity. The one on the right, all the way on the right, you can think of as a libertarian individualism. And that vertical dashed line represents different kind of dividing line between different approaches. One, those on the right would not get to universal health insurance coverage, and those on the left would get to universal health insurance coverage. And what I've depicted here is there are Republicans that range from yes, wanting universal coverage to not, and Democrats who range from definitely wanting universal coverage to not, with some overlap in the middle. The House Republican Freedom Caucus, really a pretty strong market-oriented small government folks, dominate on the right. Among Democrats, you have people like Senator Bernie Sanders who have promoted things like Medicare for all. Now, these get reinforced by that social dimension on this particular issue. Why? Because for social conservatives, what they really are opposed to, among other things on the healthcare front, is one, anyone telling a religious organization or even religious owners of a company what to do with their healthcare. And two, in particular, opposing any government funding or promotion of abortion. So there is a confluence of the economic small government with the social small government, or with the social making sure that government is securing social conservatism by not promoting liberal ideas like pro-choice on abortion. And for Democrats, in some ways, it is reinforced, maybe a little more difficult sometimes, by social democrats who really do want to push the envelope of using government in an extremely big way to more or less finance the entirety of roughly 1/5 of the economy, which is the overall healthcare system in all of its dimensions. And so that's a Medicare for all notion, a single payer, government financed healthcare, dental care, long-term care, vision care that Bernie Sanders had put forward. And what you get in the middle is an effort to kind of straddle these differences, what President Obama put forward with his Democratic colleagues in Congress at the time, the Affordable Care Act, which is really an amalgamation of ideas that came from Republican and conservative roots with Democratic Party commitments to universal coverage. this is how we're getting at the underlying differences of the society and how challenging it makes to move forward on particularly big policy issues like something like healthcare reform. Now, when we put this in party terms, this was a study done looking at political parties around the world in democratic societies and looking at what their manifestos were, and what in the United States we call those the party platforms, and looking at a variety of dimensions of those manifestos or platforms to see whether they were to the left or to the right and to what extent. And what they've done then is come up with a metric that has located the US Democratic Party and the US Republican Party on this single left-right dimension. And two things strike out. One is One is that the Democratic Party in the United States stands to the left of the median party internationally, a little bit to the right of the Labour Party in the United Kingdom, a little bit to the right of the the Liberal Democratic Party in the United Kingdom, and somewhat to the right of the Social Democratic parties in Scandinavia. The Republican Party, on the other hand, is really well to the right here. In the international context in particular, it is pretty close to being a right-wing party. It is to the right of the Conservative Party in Canada. It's well to the right of the Conservative Party in Great Britain, and in proximity to some of the really more far-right parties that we have seen emerge in Europe recently. So if this is accurate, if this is an appropriate characterization of where these parties have stated themselves to be in their platforms, the Republican Party is really anchoring a fairly significant hard right conservative party. And we'll see some of that in the domestic data as well. I'm going to end part 2 there, and I'll bring you back for part 3 when we get into some very interesting visuals on the geographical divides in the United States. But for now, let me bring this one to a close.